So this is a series of 3 microtalks centered around a theme, and that theme is how to run an indie studio without a surprise hit. I'm Christopher Langmuir. I'm the creative director of An Enemy Hug Interactive, and these are my fellow speakers. This is Teresa Duringer. She's the CEO of Temple Gates Games, and this is Tanya Short. She's the captain of Kitfox Games. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to dive right into it, if my slides will advance, which they aren't. Okay, cool. All right, so what do our 3 studios have in common? Like, why are we all in this panel together? So what we are is we're all about the same size. We're all about the same age. We've been around about for 5 years, and we've all got 10-ish employees. But most importantly, we don't have a runaway hit that has founded the backbone of our company's budget and runway. Right? Like, none of us have a product that has just moved a totally insane number of units out of nowhere. All of us are sort of like very one foot in front of the other, but we've still grown a lot over the last 5 years, and I want to talk a little bit about how. So I'll start with my microtalk, which is about how to get client work and balance it against original IP development. So now, I personally only have about 7 minutes or so, so if you're watching this on the Vault later, set it to half speed, but if you're here, sorry? But seriously, my caveat is I don't actually have the answers, right? I'm going to give you a whole bunch of things that are about our experience and what I've learned, but they're very contextual to us. For example, our studio was founded in Canada. Operating in different countries is different. Different clients are different. You and your team are going to be different than me and my team. Just because something worked for us doesn't mean it's going to work for you. That being said, if I could go back in time 5 years and talk to myself before I started the studio, there's a handful of things that I think are pretty self-evident now that I'd love to tell me. And I can't do that, but there might be future me's in the audience, so I'm going to say these things to you. So a bit about An Enemy Hug Interactive, my studio. So like the rest of the studios, we've been in business for about 4 years, and we've grown a lot through that time period. And through that whole time, from the first year to the 5th, we've spent 50% of all hours company-wide on internal IP development. And that's a direct result of the fact that we've done a lot of client work. That's obviously really great, but what are other reasons why you might want to pursue this way of running a business? Okay. You can't hide from the business stuff. You actually have to be serious about this. You have to do, you actually have to incorporate, and you actually have to, set up legal agreements. And you actually have to have real negotiations, and you have to do accounting, and da-da-da-da-da. If you're just hiding in a basement for a bunch of years working on your first game, it can shelter you a lot from those business realities that you're going to really need to know how to do once you've shipped a title. And with that reliable income stream that is not from product, you're going to be able to hire a lot more diverse team. Overwhelmingly, the people with free time and capital are English-speaking North American white men, people that look like me and the other business partner who is involved in this equation. Many people can't work speculatively. Some people need a stable job, no matter how talented or driven they are. If you can offer people real employment while you're running your studio, you're going to have access to a much larger pool of talent, and it's going to make everything a lot easier. So now, before you actually start your studio, before you do anything at all, there's just a few quick tips I'd like to give you. First, these 2 things are really important if you can do it. 1, have an entire year's worth of runway before you begin. Even if you don't make a single dollar in the first year, you should be okay. Try and plan around this. You might not need it for all 365 days, but you'll be really grateful that you had it. 2, if you are currently employed, get credit now. This seems super evident to me in retrospect, but it is way easier to get credit if you have a stable job than if you are an unemployed person who owns a studio with no value, right? Try and do both of these first. But 3rd, and this is my most important takeaway from the entire talk, is get a mentor, right? My previous statements about I don't have the answers is because my advice to you is not contextual. Right? You're going to find someone who's in the space you're in, who's in the physical location who's doing the kind of stuff you want to be doing, who's bigger than you are. Someone who's already gone through the growing pains that you are hopefully going to go through. That person will be able to give you much better advice than anything in this talk I can give you. If you remember only one thing from my talk, let it be this one point. So now we're getting into the part of the talk that arguably everyone cares about. And that's how do you actually get client work? And I'm going to begin with a spoiler. All right, this is an age test. Okay, it's not this spoiler either. So what's the spoiler? This one. There's no magic wand. There's no secret trick. There's no like directory of client work that you can go onto online that only me and a handful of people know about. There's no like list of potential clients. There's no one trick that game devs hate, right? Like there's nothing like that. It's hard to get client work and it's hard to do client work. Now, with that in mind, how do you actually do it even if it's hard? So the first thing, and people hate this one, is always be networking. I hear a lot of people grumble about this, and if you manage to succeed without doing this, you are a unicorn, and you probably don't need any of my advice. You're gonna need clients, you're gonna need employees, you're gonna need friends, you're gonna need allies, you're gonna need publishers, you're gonna need everything under the sun, and you don't know what you're gonna need before you need it. These people are going to be your future clients. They're gonna be your future partners. They're gonna help you ship games, they're gonna help you do work, they're gonna give you money. Networking puts you in contact with other people, and people matter. Grow your team. Provide solutions, not labor. What I mean by this is become a full-service outfit. Try and avoid single contributor contracts. What you want to be doing is you want to be pitching things like features or ports or full games. You want to be offering something that there isn't an obvious substitution for. Now, how do you get those ones is you want to be climbing the ladder. I know I just said go broad at the beginning and network like literally all the time. What we also want to be doing is your clients are overwhelmingly going to be organizations that are a little bit bigger than you. Really big orgs, sometimes you'll get work for them, but there's a ton of other people in the mix to get those jobs. And organizations and studios that are the exact same size as you probably can't hire them, so remember, they probably can't hire you. There will be exceptions to this, but generally speaking, always be trying to target the people who are just a bit bigger than you. And if you continue to grow year over year, you're going to be meeting new members of those ladders of rungs. So you're going to want to meet a whole bunch of people one year, and the next year, the group after that. Also, don't always look for game studios. Look for games adjacent client and non-games clients. The advantages of these are manifold. Being a direct contractor means you can command better rates. There's not an obvious substitution to internal development, and just everything's easier. If you can get these kind of contracts to do, they'll make your life a lot more straightforward. This one also seems pretty obvious to me, but I haven't fought hard enough for it, and it's really hurt us in the long run, is get attribution. You want to start from a point where your game studio's name is at the very beginning of the game you're working along with all of the other studios on it. You're not going to get that, but that's going to be the point you want to start in negotiations and work your way back from them. Attribution lets other people know what you've done, and that's really important for getting future work. And we've been bad about that, and it's hurt us. However, we've been really good about this one. And I know this seems pretty obvious, but you get so much out of this. Deliver on time and deliver on budget. Be involved in the project estimation and get good at it. People are going to tell other people that you're good at this, and this is completely invaluable in this industry. Very few people are good at this, and it's going to get you a lot of work. Also, working on your own games, it's really good at being good at this. Like, knowing that you're going to launch your own title on a particular timeline is really going to help you. So how do you balance this against internal development? Now, keep in mind that all of the other stuff I just said is going to seriously burn you out creatively. I personally struggle with this a lot. Development on our game suffers from my focus on business issues, and I'm not entirely clear on how I'm supposed to compartmentalize those. Just be aware that getting and delivering client work is going to take a lot out of you and is going to take a lot out of your focus on a creative endeavor like launching your first game. Let me know if you figure out how to solve this. I still haven't figured this one out. This lack of focus has really tangible impacts on your internal development. Don't assume that just because you have 50% of the time that you're going to make a game in half the time. It's probably more like 3 times. Working on something a lot gives you a lot of deep focus and allows you to involve in deep collaboration, which really improves your productivity. If you're like switching between different games, like clients' games and your games, you're not going to be as effective. If you have a timeline that says it's going to come out in a year, it's actually going to be 3. Now, fair beans, I stole that from Gwen Frey's talk. It's really good. 3 steps for founding a successful indie studio. If you like what I'm saying, watch that one too. Now, to do this work, and this is pretty obvious in indie dev land, but you want to have people who can wear a lot of hats. Like, just because someone can do a bunch of things on your game, you might need them to do stuff for clients that have nothing to do with your game. Maybe they have graphic design acumen. Maybe they have like 2D animation skills, but you're making a 3D game. You're going to have people who can wear a ton of hats to make this work. And last but not least, protect your team from sales thrash. It's going to be really tough. You're going to be out there trying to get new contracts. Don't expose your team to all of this. You're already stressed out about it. You don't need your 3D modeler panicking about whether or not you got that contract. Be somewhat transparent so they understand the health of the studio, but every single potential client doesn't need to be your employees' problems. Anyway, I'm running out of time, and I hope this was brief but helpful, and it was really tough for us to do this, and I'm sure it's going to be tough for you. So if you want any help, reach out to me on Twitter or talk to me after the talk. I'd love to get a little bit more in the weeds on this. I just don't have the time. Thank you so much.
I'm Teresa Derringer, and I'm going to speak a little bit more towards the specifics of how to run a studio without a surprise hit using hardware and IP partnerships. So we've all heard about the indie mega hit darlings, the Hotline Miamis, Fezzes, Bastions, and Braids, but I would venture that at least some of the people in this room are not working on the top 5 grossing indie games. And however unflattering it is to address this subject, it's worth being honest about. The truth is that most indie games are not household names, mine included. So while it's really obvious what to do if you have a total hit, which is keep at it, awesome, or if you have a total flop, maybe do something else, there's a question of what do you do if your game is somewhere in between? And it's a really tough question. It's kind of embarrassing to ask. And it's a question I've had to ask myself. With my first indie game, Cannon Brawl, it made about $400,000 in sales and about $130,000 in contest winnings. It took 2 people 3 years to make, minus Steam's cut. It's about $70,000 per person per year. It's not nothing, but it's certainly not time to buy a yacht. So where do you go from here if your game is kind of like somewhere in between? After a big launch, it can be really tough to get going on the next thing or even know what that next thing is. But that's the most important thing for you to be doing right at that moment. So you just have to pick a direction. And for me, with Cannon Brawl, we got started because it had won a contest. So we found another contest, and that was the Oculus VR Jam. And don't worry, this talk is not going to be about contests, but it can be helpful to identify one thing, which is who has too much money and not enough video games. Well, not VC. For a lot of economic reasons I can't get into in a 10-minute talk, funding is not usually available to small creative studios like ours, usually. But there is an exception, and that is with speculative hardware. So we saw with VR, there was a burst of new funding in the scene, but we've seen it before with other kinds of hardware, like the PS Vita and the Ouya. And our team's been pretty bullish about this speculative hardware we've developed for Gear, Vive, Rift, Tango, Starbreeze, even Siftio. And while it can be really fulfilling to develop for this exciting new medium, and you're jumping into a community that's really lovely, you're all figuring it out together, and it feels like you're laying the tracks for the future, I would say there are some practical reasons to run away. The SDKs are changing out from under you. There are no standards. But more importantly, there are no users. So to give you a sense of my first game in VR, this was called Bazaar, and it made $6,000 total on Steam, at least. That's gross revenue, gross being the operative word there. So without money, at this point, I would say never develop for speculative hardware, except if there's money. So if you have a new platform coming on the market, especially one in an arms race between hardware manufacturers or platform interests, where they're pouring money into it, and they need content to show off the product, there is going to be some VC funding for games content that's going to make it look good. You're also going to see grants that are coming directly from the platform stakeholders themselves, like we've seen with the Oculus VR research grant for $250,000 recently. In addition to that, you're going to see other companies that want to expand their brands into this new platform space, the new hotness. So we saw airlines, TV shows approaching our company to see if we could help them with that. So if you've taken the risk of becoming an expert on a piece of hardware where there are relatively few users, so relatively few developers, you're putting your name in a kind of small hat for winning contracting bids. Bazaar had absolutely abysmal sales, but it put us on the map as a studio capable of VR development. And that's how we were able to get the funding to make Race for the Galaxy in VR from Oculus, or to do the Team Up with Discovery Channel and do the app for their content on Rift and Gear. Now, you can't always know if that cat is going to, the hat, not the cat, is going to exist. You can take some educated guesses and look and see who's pouring money into the platforms, but I'd say the biggest way to mitigate your risk here is to keep your projects to 6 months and less. That way, if the hat never shows up, you didn't risk it all. So never develop for a speculative platform, except if there's money, and also, except if there's IP. So there's a common catch-22 if you're a studio interested in getting involved with IP work, is that nobody wants to risk their evergreen IP on an unknown developer. So it can be really hard to get that first one going. But if you can approach an IP holder with a platform that they're not getting their door knocked down on, there's not as many competitors, you can get your foot in the door and build a relationship with them. And that's how we've gotten some really top-tier board game IPs at our company. This is how we got Ascension. They've already got a phone app, but we were able to approach them with a VR app and get that going. And once you have one IP, you can really use this to swing from one to the next and the next, especially for us with board games, because many designers have designed more than one game, publishers have published more than one game, so it really helps your flow. So we started with Ascension VR, then we made Race for the Galaxy, Roll for the Galaxy, and now we're on Shards of Infinity, which is in beta this week if anyone wants to give feedback on that. And these are all board games on the phone. They all share the same set of features. They're all in the same genre. So board games have a really interesting property, which is that they come with expansion packs. And these are these delightful little chunks of work that are super flexible on your schedule, and they have a really predictable return. We find 15% of our sales, our base game sales, will reap back with our expansions. Your superpower as an indie studio is you are a unit, a team of people who work really well together, especially on small projects. So you can get a project done faster than a PM at a AAA company can even get the sign-off on the headcount to do similar work. So leverage that. Move around your projects on your schedule so that if someone comes to you and they have something that needs to get done yesterday, you just drop it and drop what you're doing and you say, yes, we can do that. And that's what expansions are really good for that. But any small chunks of work will work for that. Also, if funding gets delayed for a project, then you can move those expansions up in your schedule. So once you've found a genre, it's helpful to stick to it. You can line up your next projects. You can see once we started doing board game stuff on the right, we started getting more and more projects just flowing from one to the next. The pink ones are the projects our studio has done. Also, if you stick to a genre, you're going to get a lot more return on investment for your tools. So doing board game type of tools, we have a lot of UI tools where we can do a lot of transparency, icons, and careful attention to draw order in 3D space. You're going to get more value out of that in your second, and your third, and fourth title. So you also, again, want to think about who has too much money and not enough video games. Sometimes that's your players. There's a big mistake I made with Cannon Brawl, which is it didn't have an existing genre when it came out. There wasn't really a player base for a real-time artillery game. So we had to do the work of not only building the game, but building a community for this kind of work. Not the same thing with board games. So you can just deliver something that the community is looking for, and it's a little easier. Here's a picture of where our money comes from as a studio. You can see we've moved from the longer project to the shorter ones that are about 6 months. And we make a lot of our money on direct sales, but we still supplement that with grants, work for hire, partnerships, and contests. And Race for the Galaxy has been probably our top seller. It's one of the top card games on iOS, but we've also had plenty of failures. The point of all this is that you as an indie studio can do what you want, whether that's working on a kooky piece of hardware or working on a kooky game idea. But if you don't win the lottery with that, you're not out of the game. You just have to balance out your workload with some safer bets. We have this idea of what it is to be indie, to sometimes create this beautiful, glorious magnum opus that takes 7 years to produce, and that's very valid. This is another way to be indie. It's definitely not that. This is being nimble, it's reacting to opportunities, and staying alive to make those projects that you do love withstanding successes and failures.
Hello, I'm Tanya X Short. I'm the captain of KitFox Games, and I'm here to present, I guess, maybe a more traditional idea of what it is to be an indie, and that we still haven't managed to pay ourselves $70,000 a year. That sounds great, but we are scrappily clawing our way up every year, increasing our salary through increasingly successful games, hopefully. You might know us most through Boyfriend Dungeon. We also last week announced we were going to pair with Bay 12 Games to publish Dwarf Fortress. And all of this does come back to a strategy that we settled on about 5-6 years ago. When we started, we weren't sure what we were doing. We were just sort of working together on trying to make a studio together that would survive, that we could become better designers together. The formatting's not great, but it's fine. We want to make some of the best games in the world, and in order to do that, we have to be happy, and in order to be happy and make better and better games, we have to survive. And so when it all comes down to is every time we ship a game, we're already in the middle of thinking about what is the next one and how do we help the next one be better than the last one. Not just better in terms of, I don't know, review scores or sales or whatever, but better in terms of how we make them and how we feel proud of them. So overall, we have made a lot of choices that many would call maybe fiscally conservative, safer, less risky business practices. Now, Kickstarter doesn't really fit into any of those goals in theory. In theory, you know, it obstructs your quality of life. It doesn't let you really practice your craft, and you can't sustain a studio on it. That's for sure. But this actually does fit into our underlying strategy of being opportunistic and by always trying to control our own destiny. So what I mean by opportunistic is our very first game transition is a really good example. Our first game was Shattered Planet, and it was a mobile and PC game, and we were approaching beta. And the deadline was coming up fast. We were a bit behind. It would end up getting delayed. And our advisors who had helped fund that initial seed of the game were getting very nervous. But I heard about this cool new opportunity called the Square Enix Collective. And it was nothing at the time. It was just a press release on Gamasutra. But I cold emailed them, hey, can I pitch you something? And they said, yeah, if you send me a good pitch in the next 48 hours. So I actually set aside Shattered Planet. Our advisors are freaking out. What are you doing? You need to focus on beta. And instead, I came up with the initial idea that would eventually become Moon Hunters. And the reason I did that was because I needed the team to know that I believed in them more than just the success of one game, that we were more than that we were multiple games, that we were going to survive, and that we were going to have more beyond that. No matter what happened to Shattered Planet, there was going to be a continued KitFox. So this sort of bleeds into the fact that we are very opportunistic about figuring out how our next project is going to find funding and how it's going to help us survive even if it doesn't sell very well. Ends up with us maximally diversified, which absolutely impacts our strengths and weaknesses as a studio. We're sort of maximally, like I said, we are maximally diversified. We've been around almost 6 years now, and we've released 3 major projects. We've announced 3 more, 2 of which we're publishing, and we have another thing to announce, actually. You'll get a sneak preview of that at the the Experimental Gameplay Workshop on Friday if you stick around, but please don't announce it. I don't know, it's supposed to be unannounced for another few months. We'll see how that goes. But the point is that we are now having 2 games simultaneously, side by side, in production, our own IP for PC and console, despite the fact that none of our games have sold incredibly. But it's because we've diversified in terms of having the number of titles and the variety of titles that we actually started with a core, which we can think of it in a few different ways. Steam has been our core the whole time, but system-driven role-playing games is the core of what our audience expects from us. And so we think all of our games have something in common that appeals in that way. So whether it's Dwarf Fortress or Moon Hunters or Sword Boyfriends, you're still gonna have a good time with one of our games if you're into system-driven role-playing experiences. And by having that core, we can help move them from game to game more easily if our social media is all connected. So rather than having a Moon Hunters Twitter and a Boyfriend Dungeon Discord, we just have a KitFox Twitter, we have a KitFox Discord, and we have the wonderful Victoria Tran running that for the last couple of years. It was driving me mad for the first 4, and she does a way better job, so I'm really glad we have her. But the fact is that we've centralized it as a strategy, because even though Random Gamer number 5 doesn't really care about KitFox, there's no reason for them to care about my brand. They're more likely to move on with us to the next game if they bond with us as a brand, but also they get to know us as people. So rather than getting really attached to one game and one game's mechanics, which hopefully they also enjoy the game, they actually attach to us and want us to succeed with our next game. And we have seen that as possible between our Twitter and our Discord as they grow. And all of that is possible because we've chosen to self-publish at every turn. And again, this is one of those, if you can get away with it, absolutely try to do it, because in the long term, we benefited so much from cutting our own salaries and doing our own publishing and learning our own marketing. All of our games can be found in one place on storefronts, whether it's Steam or itch or Nintendo. You can go look at KitFox and see our games, and there's no other brands competing with us for that airspace. Devolver isn't there saying this is a Devolver game, which, I respect them, but I'm glad that when you go there, there's no distractions, that you can just see what are the KitFox games. And speaking of fans being able to find us and for us learning how to talk with them and bond with them. Oh, no, that was incorrect. We also sort of identified this chain of helping them grow to engage more and more deeply with not just the game and the IP, but also just sort of bleed their own identity into being bigger and bigger fans of us. And a lot of them come in at the purchase step, of course. But by helping figure out how do we grow our fans to be super fans, we've spent a lot of energy, for example, having PAX booths, even though we don't on paper have any good reason for that. We feel very deeply that is part of our success over time. So Kickstarter is part of that decision to try to make better and better games, because it helps us centralize our fans, it helps us cement our brands, and it helps us self-publish. And so even though that money will never sustain us in the long term, it does in the long term serve all of those corporate sustainability functions. I thought I would take a second to just actually be a little bit more transparent about our finances. Diversification, you can see it on the 2 charts. You have the development costs and the revenue of our games. They're never quite the same. There's a canceled project in there that cost us money, but actually maybe paid in some way, and I'll talk about that in a second. Early on, our payroll was our primary cost, absolutely. But then the next year, so this is 2015, 2016, you can see there. And then the next year, because we had shipped Moon Hunters and it did okay, we had to start paying back loans and royalties. And this was all very complicated by the fact that we had income coming in from multiple titles as well. So trying to calculate what was actually going on with our bookkeeping was more complicated, but that's okay. Now, what I wanted to really note here was that we talk a lot about game sales. And you probably got the hint from the people talking here previously, but that's the sexiest money, but it's not the real money that a lot of us live on. For our first $1 million, game sales were only 50% of that. We had Kickstarter, we had some, did I call them investments? Yeah, we had investments, and we had Kickstarter. Oh, yeah. And what is I can't even read, it's too small on my thing. And work for hire, right. Yeah, we did some contract work that was very exciting. And it helped us survive long enough to be able to use game sales as our primary motive. But even last year, we did some work for hire that I can tell you about later. So we haven't technically done all of these revenue sources, but it's not that much of an exaggeration. We get our money from everywhere we can, and we stuff it into our bank vault, and then at the end of the year, we look and see if we can pay ourselves just a little bit more, and maybe someday we'll reach industry average. That'd be great. And just as a side note, we did talk to a few of the other studios in Montreal, and the top 3, they did get their first $1 million from sales, but the bottom 3 did not. One did very well on Kickstarter some years ago. One got most of theirs through government, which I'm not sure if that's a grant or a loan or what's going on with the government, but yeah. And then one had their first $1 million just straight from a publisher. The point is there's no one right way, but if you ask yourself what your goals are for yourself, as not only as a studio, but as a creator, then you can see where your studio should be going from here and how to get there. But it matters what your goals are. Different studios have different methods, different constraints. There's never one right way to run a company, and anyone who claims otherwise is trying to sell you something. Thank you.